This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Reagan Institute Director of Scholarly Initiatives, Dr. Anthony Eames, speaks with Dr. Ben Griffin, an Army officer who currently teaches at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. They discussed Ben's new book, Reagan's War Stories, which examined how Ronald Reagan's reading of Tom Clancy novels and other science fiction books influenced his worldview and national security policies.
Hello, and welcome to the Reaganism podcast. I'm your guest host, Anthony Eames, Director of Scholarly Initiatives for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And I'm very pleased today to be joined by Professor Ben Griffin, who's the Chief of the Military History Division at West Point and a National Security Fellow at the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin. Ben is here today to speak with us about his new book, available to all of you September 15th on Amazon, I assume, and everywhere you can buy books. New book is Reagan's War Stories, a Cold War Presidency. Ben, thanks for coming on the show. Great to have you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And just before we get going, I should note that while I'm an active duty military officer, all the thoughts and opinions I express are my own, not reflective of the government, Department of Defense, or the United States Military Academy at West Point.
All right, well, good to get those qualifications out of the way. There's a lot to dive into here, and certainly we're going to have a lot to discuss throughout this hour. But Ben, I think I want to ask you a question a little bit about how you got into writing about President Reagan from a standpoint of fiction, and just your own kind of personal journey. It's not every day that historians are writing about the way sci-fi and fiction shapes the presidential imagination. How did you come to this?
So I joke in my preface that this project started when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And when I was sitting there, was kind of bored in summer, my dad just handed me a book to read. And the book was The Hunt for October by Tom Clancy. And then, like a good preteen, I inhaled pretty much all of them and then kind of went off from there. But I've just really been interested in the interactions between how fiction sort of depicts the real world, the interpretations of it that come across there, and then how it sort of reflects back. So when I was a cadet at West Point, I did my senior thesis looking at Ian Fleming's James Bond novels and kind of how he took various aspects of sort of the rising consumerism of American culture in the 1950s, injected into what was otherwise a very British story, but yet the places Bond goes are generally American, or the Caribbean or Mexico is not so much in the UK itself. So when I got selected to come back here and teach and the opportunity to go to grad school at the University of Texas at Austin, I was looking for what I would do for my dissertation. And initially I had a totally different idea that I was going to do something about the role of the Army in peacekeeping operations, and then decided that was not where my passion was. And that I really wanted to get back into this idea of, hey, how do these stories influence people? And as I started digging into that, I was looking in and saw the Reagan quotes about Tom Clancy's novels and just kept digging more and more. And it became a really, really broad and really interesting project to me. And again, it's turned into something that I'm very proud of and looking forward to seeing get out in the world here in a couple weeks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people and readers will be kind of fascinated to read, or maybe it'll spark some of our readers' memories, is your kind of opening vignette, your opening scene. You say that fiction often reflects realities. Well, in your opening scene, you kind of present two realities through satire. That 1986 Saturday Night Live sketch. Why that sketch to open your book?
So the sketch is Ronald Reagan Mastermind, right? And you have Phil Hartman playing Ronald Reagan amid the kind of burgeoning Iran-Contra crisis. And so there's a reporter in the room with him, and she's asking him a question about what he knows. And he sounds senile, his voice is feeble and weak. And, we were all trying to find out what we knew and trying to get to the bottom of this. And I just wish I could tell you more. And she leaves, and he says, I wish that I could be more help with the very, very little that I know. And then Hartman just transforms, right? The senile grandfather goes away, like a glint comes into his eye. And he storms into the adjoining room, and there is all of Reagan's national security cabinet, right? You've got Weinberger there, you've got Schultz there, you've got national security advisor there, and they're all just sitting there waiting for him. And he launches into this rant about all the things they're going to do in order to cover up this scandal that's unfolded. That this person's going to resign. The letters on the computer, Reagan already wrote it for him. They're going to leak this to the media. They're going to quash this story. They're going to bury this person. All very direct, very clear language. But then there's an interruption. He has to go out there and give an award to a Girl Scout. And the mask slips back on there. It's back to the grandfather Reagan. He goes back to the Oval Office, says some nice things to this Girl Scout who sold all the cookies. She leaves, mask goes away. That's the part of the job I hate. And then goes back in as the staff is just very confused about what's happening and what he's telling them to do. He works longer than night. The staff falls asleep as Reagan is speaking multiple language, calculating exchange rates in his head, doing all this very high level stuff. And it's these two images of Reagan. One is the sort of the face, but just sort of the puppet of his administration. And one is the guy who's really behind it, that were very much relevant in the 1980s. And I think in the debate that's followed something about who exactly Reagan is. And you get very different answers on that question, depending on who you're talking to. Not necessarily even based off of partisan leanings, but just based off of who they were and how they worked them. And some of his closest friends and advisors all know that there was a distance to him that you just couldn't get through. While he was personable and friendly, he wasn't friends with a lot of people. And I thought that was interesting too, that just sort of enigma even to his own closest advisors, probably with the exception of Nancy, is the one who really got in and understood him best. And so using that to set the stage for the book, I think sets up nicely to try and figure out why he is closed off like that, but then also get at some of the ways that he thought and interacted with, and why then fiction might be an appealing thing for him to do that.
Right. Yeah. And you really do see his kind of reading lists, his love of fiction as an answer to this question of who Reagan is. And you come up with some really pretty interesting insights. But one of the things before we get into who Reagan is in the 1980s and who he is as a president, you start off well before then, obviously. You start off with his childhood. You start off with his days in Hollywood. You start off with his career in the governor's office and the governor's mansion. And it seems at an early point in the Cold War, Reagan perceives fiction as having a major role in shaping how we think and we define and prosecute and carry on with the Cold War. And is that something that Reagan was imagining, or is that something that's actually true, that fiction has a unusual role to play in the kind of geopolitical conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States?
So I think it's a true thing that fiction very much has a real role to currently play, but also certainly played a massive role throughout the Cold War, particularly in the 1950s. And you see this even through official government policy. The CIA is very active in promoting certain types of literature, right? They're responsible for getting Animal Farm printed and distributed behind the Iron Curtain. They're looking to publicize Dr. Zhivago, right? This very powerful anti-Soviet novel that leads to some problems then for Boris Pasternak inside of the Soviet Union. Duncan White's Cold Warriors came out, I think about 2 or 3 years ago. It was a great job kind of delving into these authors and the way both the CIA and the KGB are trying to influence these cultural narratives. And I think what Reagan really latched onto with this is that he knew that stories matter, right? That stories that you tell and that you enjoy matter because they stick with you. There are things that a good story is one that you're going to retell to your friends. You're going to say, hey, please go read this, or, what do you think of this? In a way that you're not with a lot of official government policies and memos and all that sort of stuff. And so that's why the stories and jokes are so important to him. And I think that is something that the U.S. government rightly saw, throughout the 1950s. You have Christina Klein's Cold War Orientalism talking about the work of James Michener. Something else I also touch on in some of my chapters here, where she notes that he was sort of the official translator for DoD to the broader public, introducing them to things like the B-52, talking about the way the Korean War was fought. The Bridges at Tokari is a fantastic Korean War novella that really paints a fairly stark picture of why people are in Korea in a way that is engaging and memorable, that it's just tough to meet when you're sitting there in a press conference. And so for Reagan, he is consuming all this literature that the CIA is pushing, right? Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon is one of these books as well. A former communist who broke with the party in the wake of the show trials in the late 30s. And so he writes this book that is more or less a fictionalized account of what happened in the show trials, where they force an original revolutionary to kind of admit to treason that he never committed and accept his execution for the benefit of the party. What's remarkable about that book to me is it's written, and we published in 1940, without access to the Soviet archives. And yet, you go back and you look at Bukharin's letter to Stalin right before his execution, and it's pretty spot on with what Rubashov is saying in this book. Now, so Reagan is reading this story, is powerfully moved by it. And he's equating what he's seeing there with his own experiences in Hollywood at the time, when he is seeing communists active in various trade unions and some of the advocacy groups in Hollywood at the time. And he's seeing similarities between the tactics. And it's not the same thing, right? Not the same level. It's important to note that. But he's making these connections, and it's creating a powerful sense of this is what communists do, and this story conveys that, and therefore it should be read widely. And I think carries it with him very consistently for the rest of his life, honestly.
Yeah, so it seems like these kind of defectors, these artists and authors who have a kind of major break, mid-century break with communism and the Soviet Union, really shape Reagan's worldview. Is that a worldview that he kind of already has developed through other channels and other sources, and it's reinforced, or is it something that folks like George Orwell are really kind of giving him something new to think about?
I think it's kind of a simultaneous development is what you're seeing with this, because Reagan did serve in the military during World War II as part of one of the Hollywood units there. He's recording plays and movies in order to support the war effort. He is also involved in narrating reconnaissance videos for pilots about to go on bombing missions in Japan. And there's one where he appears with the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, and they're praising the Soviets, right, as the guarantors of freedom. And this is even as they're doing appalling things in Eastern Europe, as they're fighting and defeating the Nazis, but they're leaving a lot of bodies in their wake and a lot of other crimes behind them. And so Reagan clearly has no issue doing this when it's necessary in the 1940s, like most of the American population. And there's no evidence of him criticizing, Mission to Moscow, for example, when it's released by the Warner Brothers in the early 40s. As soon as that shifts, though, he becomes a pretty stark critic of it, right? And so you see in this period, 47, 48, as he's getting more involved in Hollywood policy or Hollywood politics, that this starts to evolve. He becomes, the president of SAG. He appears before the House Un-American Activities Committee as a friendly witness, and admits that, hey, there are communists in this guild that are trying to do things, but they're not particularly powerful. In his book that comes out in the early 60s, Where's the Rest of Me, he talks about these experiences he has trying to break up groups that are denouncing an anti-communist message in HICASP and in SAG and in some of these trade unions, and about his own fear when he is threatened with what he perceives to be an attack on his person that would mar his face, leading him to carry a pistol for a little while, right? And so he feels personally attacked. He sees this, what he perceives as infiltration and active efforts by communists to change the tone and tenor of Hollywood movies. And it is all happening, right? This is things that it's not untrue. I think the scope of it is greater in his mind than it is in reality, perhaps, and the effect is greater in his mind than in reality, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so as he's doing this, that's when he's exposed to people like Arthur Koestler. He starts reading, George Orwell, Homage to Catalonia, for example, Animal Farm, 1984. Whittaker Chambers' Witness has a powerful impact on Reagan. That's a book that he's going to be able to quote verbatim for the rest of his life when he's talking about the importance of religion in fighting communism. And this is religion sort of in the generic sense of faith in a higher power as opposed to a particular religion, which goes into why he was attempting to reach out to the Catholic Church when he was president and other religious groups as well. But these are creating a powerful sense of, okay, this is what communists do, because he's seeing it in his personal life on a small scale, reading about it with these people who have broken with the party on a broader scale, and then understanding the things that led to their break and trying to leverage on that in his messaging to move things forward in the future, with, again, religion being one of the more prominent roles in that.
Yeah, the Whittaker Chambers story is kind of an interesting one. If you want to give it a little background on Whittaker Chambers and why his kind of stories and accounts and defection might be particularly informative to President Reagan when he comes into the office.
Yeah, so Whittaker Chambers from New York went to Columbia University, was recruited to work with the NKVD while he was there. Initially, just sort of helping to agitate and recruit for other communist parties in the area, but eventually kind of going under deep cover to recruit agents and pass intelligence over to the NKVD in the Soviet Union. Does this throughout the mid to late 30s. He eventually encounters a NKVD handler who kind of sparks fear in him. And this is at the same time when there's a lot of purges going on, both in Spain and with the Great Terror back in the Soviet Union. And his handler implies that he might purge Chambers, and also that, hey, some of Chambers' friends were in fact assassinated by either this handler's word or, by someone else in the NKVD. So Chambers runs away to Florida, officially breaks from the party. But the thing that he cites with his true break from communism is not those interactions, but rather that the party didn't want him to have his baby with his wife, and they do it anyway. And at one point in time, he's looking at his daughter's ear and realizing the perfection of that design, and that design has to come from a higher power. And so in his book, Chambers talks about, how the character from The Hunchback of Notre Dame led him to character from Les Miserables led him to join communism and then break with communism. And that is the character of the bishop, who's first got his palace and lives opulently, and it's a sign of, well, it's bad, but then it also opening up, using it as a hospital to care for people. And so, Chambers crediting that religious awakening with the true moment of his break with communism. And then the high drama that follows of the Chambers Hiss trial, ultimately leading to Hiss's conviction for perjury. And much later on, the revelation that Hiss was in fact a Soviet agent, codenamed Ailes, along with Harry Dexter White, who was famous for the Bretton Woods. Again, captured Reagan's imagination. So it wasn't a work of fiction, but it reads like a spy novel to him. And so Reagan, seeing this loner inspired by stories, but then finding faith and then leading because of that, while also comparing the treatment that he sees Chambers' handler give him with that of what he's seeing from some of the directors of some of the communist activity in the trade unions he's been working around, who are threatening to throw acid in people's faces, who are attacking buses and in the studios. Equating the two in his mind creates that connection, and realizing that I'm going to push this idea of religion. And Reagan becomes very involved in trying to rehabilitate some of the blacklisted screenwriters in Hollywood. Most famously putting in a Variety article that, you too can be free men again. And for him, that religion was the path to that.
So the kind of blacklist controversy in Hollywood is obviously a heady time in Washington, also a heady time in California and Southern California. If we could fast forward 20, 25 years to another heady time in Washington and in California and Southern California, to the Vietnam War, specifically the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and the kind of phenomenon that we now call the Vietnam syndrome. Give me a little sense of kind of Reagan's response to Vietnam syndrome, what Vietnam syndrome is, and how that response kind of shaped a kind of cultural answer to the Vietnam syndrome in itself.
So the Vietnam syndrome is this idea that, we can't get into this major war because we become a quagmire. We're going to get stuck there and we'll be defeated, and we can't possibly use our great military might in order to get out of a situation like that, or to win and prevail in combat. This is coming out of what was a failure of a war in Vietnam, where the U.S. is ultimately unable to achieve its political and strategic objectives there, despite a good amount of success in tactical level engagements on the ground. And so what Reagan comes to think is that we have all this great success by our fighting soldiers. We win the majority of our engagements with the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. Not all of them. There are notable victories for the Vietnamese in the conflict, but the vast majority of them do tend to go the U.S.'s way. And so how do we have this tactical success and are unable to make it a strategic victory, actually a strategic failure? And so what Reagan is seeing is he thinks that it's a question of the national will, that there was not the will to support the fighting soldier, there was not the will to do what needed to be done in the country, and that the stories that are being told about the conflict are an important part of that. And so as the decade continues on, Reagan is still very vocal on his radio show about what happened in the conflict. He is actively defending Lieutenant Calley, the author of the My Lai massacre, which is reprehensible. But it goes into his sense that Calley was somehow failed by the U.S. government and by the American people. He's particularly offended by what Hollywood has done with the Vietnam War in this time. And so as the 70s roll on, you have a lot of films that are really fantastic pieces of cinema, things like Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, and The Killing Fields, but they certainly have a particular depiction of the U.S. soldier or the U.S. service member, and it's not a positive one, right? They're all damaged, either engaged in atrocities or dealing with their lack or their witnessing of these atrocities going on. And so it's a very bleak picture of the U.S. military. And this is paired with a political environment where we've just gone to the all-volunteer army, where the military is struggling to rebuild in the wake of the Vietnam War, where morale is low, equipment is generally poor, and there's a sense that good people don't serve, perhaps, in the military in the mid-1970s. And so as Reagan's entering office, some of this has started to turn, right? And it's worth giving credit to Carter and Secretary Brown for the 79-80 increased defense spending. They started some of these programs that Reagan's going to expand on. But Reagan is very clear about his desire to change the way Americans think about service and to combat this idea of the Vietnam syndrome. And so the great example of this in the archives is one of the drafts of his speech to West Point. All right, so he came to West Point to give the commencement address in 1981. And this was supposed to be paired with the speech at Notre Dame to kind of give a sense of a new direction, a new awakening in American policy. And in this first draft of the speech, there's a paragraph that basically tears into Hollywood for its reprehensible behavior and anti-American sentiments. And in the margin are those movies I mentioned, Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, and The Killing Fields. And this didn't make the final cut of the speech, I think in part because Reagan didn't want to offend entertainment industry that early, and he still has connections and friends to it. And that was sort of also on the advice of the administration, but it shows how clearly they're thinking about this and how much they want to turn the way, the Vietnam War in particular is portrayed in culture, but just the American military in general as well, to make it seem more noble and more honorable as they're trying to rebuild American power there.
And that turnaround does take place, right? And there's some movies that you talk about a lot in your book that seem to indicate that turnaround by the mid 1980s is almost fully complete. And what are some of those films that stand out to you? I think there's one back in the theaters that comes to mind.
Yeah, so, Top Gun obviously is the one now with the sequel Maverick, which may actually be better than the original if you're not.
Oh, I have to check that out.
Yeah, it's really well done. But yeah, so Top Gun, you have this image of young, good-looking pilots who are engaged in perhaps unhealthy competition, but certainly the patriotic masculine competition. Think of the beach volleyball scene there. With the height of American technology, they're fighting a faceless communist force, and they beat them fairly handily. Right? There's the real conflict isn't between the American pilots and the communists; it's between themselves. They're striving to be the best pilots in service of their nation. Right? It's a fantastic piece of recruitment for the Navy, and the Navy is very involved in supporting it, loaning an aircraft carrier and some planes because the message is so favorable. Another favorite is Rambo First Blood Part 2, right, where you have Rambo literally going back to Vietnam to refight its, famously asking, do we get to win this time? And apparently freed of the shackles that held him behind, he goes to rescue these POWs who have been left behind, which is a play on one of those long-standing myths coming out of the Vietnam War that Reagan was talking about in the 70s of these left behind POWs, right? we failed our service members and we left them behind. We abandoned them to the North Vietnamese, and now they're being exploited. And so Rambo Part 2 is looking at this. He goes in there, and in fact, there are POWs in Rambo Part 2 that weren't actually there in reality, but he rescues them only after ignoring orders to leave them behind again, right? The CIA suit who was running the operation decides it's too risky and tries to get the whole thing scrapped, abandons Rambo, but he's able to steal a helicopter, fly it away from the prison camp, rescuing the POWs, goes back in, and one of the last scenes, is pointing an M60 at the CIA guy who starts to cower before Rambo turns and shoots up all the electronic equipment instead. Then goes out, turns down his second Medal of Honor, saying, "Give it to them instead." Right, but very much saying that no, we now won Vietnam. We can do this again.
Do you see? We talked Top Gun and Maverick, Vietnam Syndrome. There's probably those out there who would say it bears some resemblance to the conversation about forever wars. Do you see any sort of parallels between that moment and that cultural moment and the way President Reagan interacted with it and the moment we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, I think there's some fairness in that comparison, right? It's always tough when you have wars that have drug on a long time. At the time, Vietnam was the longest war in American history. Afghanistan replaced that one, and it had an ending that was not what we were looking for, right? It's pretty clear we did not achieve what we wanted to do in Afghanistan. And so, the narratives around the military coming out of that are kind of interesting to watch unfold here. I think one of the things that is different perhaps between when the Vietnam War was ending and when the war in Afghanistan ended last year, and the bulk of the war in Iraq ended a few years ago, although there are still forces doing things in Syria. What you're looking at is that there's been a lot of effort to maintain this reservoir of support for the military, of the sort of thank you for the service type of stuff, and there's goods and bad with that, with regards to the level of interaction the American population has with the military. But I don't think it's been quite the same turn or quite the same negative perception that you would have had before. But we're also in a point where we have the very low recruiting numbers right now, and there are some questions about the direction of the force, particularly as we're looking to pivot more towards large-scale combat.
Well, some of the kind of things you've touched upon, U.S. military operations against, say, peer-level foes, or the effectiveness of the fighting force, or the national will to confront the Soviet Union and confront adversaries of freedom. Those all seem to make their way into kind of the notion of technological romanticism that appears throughout the Reagan administration, that President Reagan really seems to promote throughout his time in office. And you suggest there is a kind of a background in his reading in fiction in this. What are some of those key works that really shaped his ideas about technology and its relationship to morality and this kind of romantic worldview?
So when Reagan gave his Clinton address to the Air Force Academy, he talks about this idea of what technology and free people can do. His sort of equation is, technology plus freedom equals unlimited potential, right? That this is the answer to not just the Cold War, but to unlocking a greater life for pretty much everybody across the world. And I think, and in the book I talk about this a lot, it dates back to his reading of Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars novels, is where this begins. And Reagan is a huge fan of the John Carter novels, even more so than the Tarzan novels that Burroughs is probably better known for. To the point where, in 79, 80, Reagan is writing in response to questions from librarians that, I really wish this character was better known. I'm a sucker for hero worship, and this is the character that I like to worship, basically. And what you have in the John Carter novels is a former Confederate cavalryman who is magically transported to Mars, Barsoom in Burroughs's book. And because of the lower gravity there, he is able to leap giant, rock pillars. He runs faster. He's stronger because he's used to the heavier gravity of Earth. And he's able to pair this with his own moral compass, this sense of, individual liberty and freedom to gradually become the warlord of the planet. But a nice warlord that, it seems kind of weird to phrase it that way, right? But a warlord who respects individual liberty, I suppose. And he's ending in these books with married to, the most beautiful woman on the planet. And, it's this pairing of, his moral compass, his moral code to do the right thing and to not oppress and enslave people. Again, weird for an ex-Confederate cavalryman, but certainly something that is coming across in the pages here. And then paired with his ability to use this advanced Martian technology that leads to the success and this utopian sense of where Barsoom is heading by the end of the third book. And Reagan remains a lifelong fan of the genre of science fiction. He engages it clearly. He has conversations, and in his letters, it's clear that he is very much aware of where the field has gone and ongoing developments. He's a big Star Trek fan. At one point, after he's out of office, he goes to visit the set of The Next Generation. And Patrick Stewart mentions that usually people would ask Patrick Stewart as the captain, Picard, to sit in his chair, and Reagan just sat in the captain's chair on the Enterprise set, right? And so it's this lifelong love of the genre. I think it captures his imagination. You see the same things coming out in his speeches about NASA. When the Challenger exploded there, that sometimes these things we think have become ordinary when they're really not, right? That it's amazing we have made something as incredible as going to space seem like a commuter flight. But he would be very fond of equating anything in space to pioneers and to his vision of the American frontier and the American West, saying that this is where the American spirit needs to take us next. Kind of a manifest destiny for the stars. Almost.
Yeah, he does seem to have this kind of go west young man mentality. I mean, of course, Reagan is born in Dixon, Illinois, and finds himself in California not too many years later by way of Iowa. What brought him to Los Angeles?
So this is where I gotta talk about how I get to put everything that I love into this book in some way, shape, or form. Right, I got the Clancy novels that I read when I was 11, thanks to my dad. I've got all the science fiction stuff, and so here's where I got to bring in the Chicago Cubs because Reagan gets a job working for an Iowa radio station, and he is calling Chicago Cubs baseball from Davenport, Iowa, not from Wrigley Field. And he convinces the station to let him go to spring training. So that way he can get stories that add a little more color to his broadcast. And he sends dispatches there back to the station as he's there talking about how, a young Cub reporter got into a two-hit fight of him getting hit and him in the ground basically by ticking off one of the ball players and all that kind of stuff. But while he's there, the first year he's able to start a process that his second year leads to him getting a screen test. And then shortly after he returns from a second trip to Catalina, where the Cubs did spring training, and then he gets a contract offer and is able to move out to Hollywood to act full time.
Oh, I didn't know the Cubs did their spring training in Catalina.
Yeah, it was Catalina all the way up until I want to say the early 80s is when we really start kicking off in Arizona.
Okay.
Practice league there.
Maybe if they moved back to Catalina, they'd start winning again.
Yeah, I wish. That'd be fantastic.
All right. Well, there's probably one particular program and initiative that's more associated with sci-fi or with technological romanticism or utopianism than any initiative pursued by President Reagan. That's the Strategic Defense Initiative. What opponents would later call, or actually in the moment call, Star Wars, which in some ways is still remembered that way. Reagan seems to come to SDI through a mix of knowledge of what's happening behind the scenes in the defense community, in the scientific community, but also, again, through his reading of fiction. Give us some key points on how SDI came to be through this close reading of fiction.
And so as Reagan gets elected, a group forms that's the Citizen Advisories Council, and it's made up of prominent scientists, people like Edward Teller, former astronauts. Buzz Aldrin is a part of this. Senior people in sort of the military industrial establishment. There are contractors from Northrop Grumman. There are active generals that are involved in this process as well. And then science fiction writers, with Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven being the two most prominent that are involved in this. And the first session of this group is held at Larry Niven's house in Tarzania, California, named for Edgar Rice Burroughs' character. And what Nivens and Pournelle and a couple of the other writers that are involved do is they sort of take the jargon-heavy stuff that's being pushed forward by Teller and others and try and make it into something that is digestible. And they produce this report. It goes through the National Security Council to Reagan, and he reads it and likes it. And some of the language actually makes its way into his speech when he's announcing SDI. And that's part of it. Wouldn't it be better to protect people than to avenge them, basically? Edmund Morris, when he wrote Dutch, rather unorthodox biography of Reagan, wonders about the influence of John Carter on this as well, because there you do have walking cities with giant glass domes to protect them from missile attacks. And I wasn't able to find a direct link there, but again, I think it goes to just this general love of technology, and Reagan's sense that with technology, you can do anything as long as you let people explore those options. And so I think between that, we're seeing the Citizens Advisory Council and his love of other works, I think Starship Troopers being another one, that he's coming to this conclusion that it's, if not possible now, it will be, and it is the morally correct thing to do that.
And so if you could just give our listeners a little broader context about what SDI was and why was it, considered possible or not possible or up for debate and controversial, and why Reagan's view of technology had such a big role to play in pushing it forward.
And so the idea of the program was that we were going to be able to shoot down incoming missiles. And there were nuclear missiles being fired by the Soviet Union. There were a number of different approaches and theories as to how you could do this. Some looking to have land-based interceptors, some looking to detonate nuclear weapons in space before re-entry of these missiles, some looking to use lasers to shoot them down. And what the Advisory Council decided to do is we don't care which one gets pushed, we just want to make sure the concept gets forward. And Brilliant Pebbles probably being the most prominent one going forward from that point in time. Again, looking at kind of having a bunch of small projectiles in space, being able to disable the system as it's going forward. The questions about its feasibility and its expense were the ones that really dominated the debate around time, right? Because these missiles are traveling very fast, and there was not a computer with the processing power capable of calculating trajectories for the missiles as Reagan's announced this program in '83. And it is an expensive piece of the defense budget as this is going along. So it's costing a lot of money, and it's unclear if this technology will ever be able to be fielded, and it's provocative. There's concerns that, if we are able to field this or about to field this, the Soviets will feel compelled to attack in order to use their weapons before they lose them, basically. And so that's this idea that it's impossible, it's expensive, and it is in fact dangerous leads to substantial opposition. Again, Ted Kennedy calling it the Star Wars scheme, and that being the name that sticks, and Reagan not loving that name despite loving science fiction. And within science fiction, it becomes a hot point of discussion too, back to the idea of how these stories matter, and Reagan's sense that the culture matters. So you have, at the time, kind of the big three of science fiction, the ones who sort of moved it from being something in a pulp magazine to a real respectable genre. You have Isaac Asimov, you have Arthur Clarke, and you have Robert Heinlein. And they get very involved in the discussions around SDI's feasibility, despite their, let's say, limited actual scientific background in a lot of cases. They certainly aren't directly working on these issues. Larry Niven notes that the discussion around SDI damn near tore the science fiction community in half, because you do have a lot of hostility around this, where you have Pournelle, you have Niven, you have Heinlein, all very active in supporting SDI and promoting it. And so people who are in favor of it are grabbing their works, waving around, saying, hey, this author said that this is possible, and using them as a credible voice, as credible as any of the scientists or military leadership involved. Reagan writes a letter thanking the Citizens Advisory Council for their support, telling them they're doing a great service to the country. Then you have people like Clarke and Asimov who are very much against it. Clarke actually writes a short story that appears inside a internal government newsletter called On Golden Seas. And it's about a effort to create technology that will extract gold from the seawater, but eventually causes the oceans to get drained because the US and the Soviets are racing to fill their gold shortage by draining the ocean. So they have it's a very clear metaphor or allegory, I should say. And I think he picked a President Kennedy in that just to tweak Reagan as well. I don't think Reagan ever read it, right? But that Clark has taken time as this huge figure in science fiction to write a story that will have a publicate or a readership of maybe dozens. I'm not sure how people read the internal Pentagon newsletters. It is telling of his view of how important that is. Clark also testifies in front of Congress. That leads to a very nasty break in his relationship with Heinlein, where Heinlein sees him at a meeting in the future and says, "How dare Clark, as a Brit, get involved in U.S. domestic politics, and who does he think he is?" And Clark backs off on it later on, his opposition saying, "Yeah, well, maybe it wasn't possible, but it scared the Soviets, and maybe there was value in that." And then Heinlein and Asimov also just completely fall out over this. They had a long relation going back to when Heinlein got Asimov a job during World War II, working in a laboratory in Philadelphia to support the defense industry. Asimov blames Heinlein's wife for turning him into this conservative, and in his view, moron, and thinks that Reagan marrying Nancy did the same thing to Reagan. And Asimov gets the last word in this because his autobiography comes out after Heinlein dies, and he is pretty nasty to Heinlein in the biography. Just showing the animosity that was there with this. But in the same way, people latched on to Niven, Pornell, and Heinlein. Opponents latched on to Clark and Asimov. And really, science fiction becomes a major part of this debate and discussion around SDI and the Star Wars program.
So that's the contemporary aspect of things. I mean, is there a longer-lived cultural legacy and technological legacy of SDI?
I mean, the program is not the same level it used to. Certainly, we have seen things like the Iron Dome in Israel. You do see technology where anti-missile intercepts are there. ASAT technology, anti-satellite technology, isn't quite the same, but it certainly was on the same boat of discussions around that, and that is almost routine now. We're looking at the ability to shoot down satellites, and so I think we've seen as the processing powers evolve, the feasibility of the program at least is more doable, right? Certainly on a small scale. Perhaps not in the large scale that Reagan envisioned, but missile defense is very much alive.
And any cultural echoes as well?
I haven't seen as many of those in the contemporary one. Is there especially what you're thinking of?
Well, now that I put the question to myself, I think there was a movie on Netflix not too long ago that came out that, God, I can't even remember the name of it, but it did really bring up the missile defense concept as this kind of it brought nuclear weapons back into Hollywood as this kind of MacGuffin, and I can't remember it. We're also not being paid by Netflix to advertise the film, so it's not worth remembering.
Right now it's more on the deterrence side. Actually, it's check out the name right here. Yeah, Cixin Liu's Earth's Remembrance trilogy. It's a book of 3 science fiction novels. He's a Chinese author. Books have been translated out in the States, I think, for 10-ish years, though. But and apologies for the light spoilers here for people who haven't read it, right? But the book goes very much into this idea that the universe is deeply populated, that there are all kinds of alien races, and we all want to kill each other. And so what's happening is that the galaxy is like a dark forest where animals are going past each other silently, and as soon as one is revealed, then they die because something nasty gets sent their way. And in the trilogy, an alien race is trying to come over and take over Earth as a new place because they live on a planet that's inhospitable to them. And we end up coming up with a deterrence mechanism that's, well, you can come here and take over because you have better technology. But what we'll do is then we'll just make sure we broadcast where we are to everyone in the universe so that eventually one of them will find us and kill us.
Right.
So it's a form of missile defense, I suppose.
Right. Huh. Interesting. Well, there's some other things we should dive into, because we can't have a conversation about Ronald Reagan and science fiction without bringing up probably the most important fiction writer in Ronald Reagan's mind, and perhaps one of the most important fiction authors of the last 50 years, and that's Tom Clancy. And you really walk through a bunch of Clancy's books and their impact on Reagan, their real-time impact on Reagan, and Reagan's real-time impact on Tom Clancy. You can tell that story much better than I can, so please, by all means.
All right, so I think part of this goes back to one of the earlier questions we had about the efforts to defeat the Vietnam syndrome, right? This sense of malaise about what American power can do and about the American military. And so, throughout Reagan's first term, you're seeing these efforts to kind of build up public support for the military, provide better technology for the military. And so Tom Clancy, who is an insurance agent at this time, working at a family agency kind of midway between DC and Annapolis, is very much buying into this, wants to be involved in this, has always wanted to be a writer. And so he writes this story that becomes The Hunt for October, about a Soviet missile submarine and its crew of officers who want to defect, taking the ship and its advanced, nearly silent Caterpillar drive to the United States, and everything that bolts from there. And so Clancy gets this published really through sheer luck, is kind of the way to look at it. He takes it unsolicited to the Naval Institute Press, publishes my book, by the way. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it. And because they had published a article he wrote, or a letter he wrote to their journal Proceedings a couple of years prior to that. And he was lucky because they had just decided, yeah, we're going to publish original fiction now, as long as it is quote unquote wet, having to do with the Navy, given that they are the Naval Institute. And so the book gets published with a relatively limited run. It's doing pretty well in the DC area and in New York City, not on a trajectory where it's going to be a international bestseller or something that's going to make Clancy a household name. Like even his letters, he's talking about, the odds of becoming the next Frederick Forsyth are, impossible to imagine. It's won a dust jacket with my name on it, is what he is talking about with this. But one of Reagan's longest term advisors, Nancy Reynolds, who was director of electronic communications for him when he was governor in California, and who was a close friend of Nancy Reagan, sees this book, is flying to Argentina, reads the book as she's flying to Argentina, recognizes that it is exactly the kind of story that Reagan would like, that Reagan being a sucker for hero worship and a particular type of character, right? They're looking at, really the character governed by a strong moral code, who is not seeking to get recognition for what he's doing, but only satisfaction that they have done the right thing, is sort of what Reagan's looking for. And that is Jack Ryan, kind of Boy Scout emeritus there to a T. So she gives Reagan this book for Christmas in 1984. He stays up late reading it, goes to meeting the next day, tells everyone in the room, hey, I'm sorry, I'm sluggish today. I was up all night reading this book. And so the staff gets the message, right? Like, okay, boss is reading this book. They all go out and they buy this book. So this gets picked up on by the Washington Post, a couple other places saying, hey, all the administration people are reading this book by an insurance agent, Hunt for October. Eventually someone asked Reagan, what are you reading? And he says, hey, it's The Perfect Yarn. It calls it unputdownable in a Time magazine article, and it starts to take off. Reagan hosts Clancy at the White House for a brief meeting, and then there's luncheon with Clancy and a lot of the national security advisors afterwards in March of '85. And the next week, the book's on New York Times bestseller list for the first time. And so what Reagan is seeing as he's reading this is basically a fictionalized version of his first term. So the American military, everyone serving in it, is portrayed incredibly well in Clancy's telling. It's a far cry from the movies of the late 70s, The Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunters. Right? All the American technology works perfectly. The only real threat to American technological supremacy in the book is the Caterpillar drive, which doesn't actually exist. All the American technology in the book does exist, and it works well. And it's, again, showing this narrative that good people using high technology are going to pull off what seems to be impossible. And all the things that that Reagan has talked about being the downfall of the Soviet pop up right there, their lack of ability to inspire people, their poor production processes, the tyrannical nature of their government, all served to foil the Soviet efforts to reclaim their submarine, leading to a great victory for the U.S. And so I think Reagan takes this novel as a vindication, right? So it's a novel that he would have liked in the first place because it's got to have a hero that he likes. But it becomes a very personal one for him because it's telling him that people are understanding the story he wants to tell and are starting to tell it. And that's where he starts to push that book very hard. Cap Weinberger writes a book review of it that appears in the Wall Street Journal and the Times Later Supplement, treating it very seriously. He's calling it something that anyone who is serious about national security needs to read. Weinberger read it because his longtime secretary said, hey, I have a good authority. The big boss across the river is really into this. And so he's like, okay, I got it. And he does this and puts it out, right? And Weinberger has been a long-term book reviewer for the San Fran Chronicle. He did that for 20 odd years when he was in the legislature out in California, and also publishes reviews of the Born Supremacy, Robert Ludlum's book in 1986. And he rips that one apart.
Really?
Yeah, he hates that book because the U.S. government does bad things in the book. We do very illegal things in the book. And he laments that it has the inevitable Le Carré syndrome, and that it's not an accurate story of what we do. And so, again, the administration is very much getting behind the Hunt for October for that reason. And so when Clancy visits Reagan in the White House, he asks about his next book, because Clancy mentions he's writing another one. And Clancy tells him it's about World War III. Reagan asks him who wins, and Clancy says the good guys. And so the next year, in 86, that book comes out, Red Storm Rising, which Tom Clancy co-writes with Larry Bond. It comes out in August of 86, and Reagan reads it sometime between August of 86 and the end of September. And I can pinpoint it that well because he gets on the plane to go to Reykjavik to have a summit with Gorbachev to talk about nuclear weapons. And you would think, okay, going back to the plane and talk to my advisors, I'm going to throw weights, number of missiles, all this kind of technical stuff. And that was never Reagan in the first place. That's not what he likes to talk about anyway. But he sits down and wants to talk about the book he just read, which is Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy. He calls it research because part of the book takes place in Iceland, where the summit is going to be. And the staff kind of laughs at him. That's a good joke, sir. But he wasn't actually joking. All right. And so the plane lands there. They have the summit, and they famously come very close to eliminate nuclear weapons in the 10-year window. But Reagan won't give up SDI, and things fall apart. So he flies back to D.C., and Margaret Thatcher gives him a call. And Thatcher is unhappy with Reagan's performance because at the time, the thinking was that the U.S. and NATO needed nuclear weapons because the conventional forces in Eastern Europe that the Warsaw Pact could muster were something that would overwhelm the U.S. and NATO conventionally there, right? The idea that, even in active defense and then replaced by air-land battles, you've got to prepare to fight outnumbered and win, and the win still relied on nuclear weapons to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And so Thatcher calls him up and says, hey, great job, Ronnie, at the summits, except for that part where you almost destabilized the balance of power in Europe. And Reagan's, takes that in stride. He's like, well, I don't really see it that way, Margaret. You should read Red Storm Rising. I think it shows a good picture of where we're at right now. And so, again, he's recommending this book that is all of 2.5 months old at this point in time to his closest ally and partner to understand how he sees the world. And what the book is, as Clancy promised, a fictionalized World War III. Mm-hmm. You have a fight between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. NATO, the good guys, do win. It is not the first book to tell that story, and not the first one to tell that story that Reagan read. Reagan also read The Third World War by General Sir John Hackett, but never really referenced that one publicly or talked a lot about the book. I think Clancy's a better writer than Hackett is. He has better narrative structure, better characters. It's easier to get into the book. But I think really the ending of the books is telling. In the Third World War, there is a limited nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union, who destroys Birmingham, and the NATO forces, which destroy Minsk. In Red Storm Rising, the Soviets are given the order to fire nuclear weapons, and their general refuses, and there's a coup, right? And so throughout this Red Storm Rising, all the American stuff is working perfectly. Airland battle is working as advertised. All the new systems that the administration has brought in over the last 5-6 years are, just killing Soviet tank formations in massive quantities after initial early setbacks in the conflict. And then the war ends as favorably as possible for NATO as we're looking at this. And I think, that's what helps make it sound to Reagan, is that it's a miniature war game for him that is realistic enough. And I think you can argue for or against what would have happened had the Soviets and the U.S. gone to war with the stuff in 86, right? But certainly by 96, I think it's pretty clear that U.S. technology had far outstripped and passed where the Soviets were. And we kind of saw that with Desert Storm, where the best U.S. stuff just plowed through the best Soviet stuff at the time. And so then that plays into Reagan's longstanding nuclear abolition, where if we don't need it to guarantee peace in Europe and in the world, it's no longer a protecting element. It's now dangerous, unstable, and apocalyptic. And therefore, why not get rid of it when I think I have an advantage that the other side doesn't perceive with regards to our relative conventional strength?
So the Soviet Union, of course, looms large, and Reagan's thinking about the world and looms large in the books he's reading. It seems like Reagan has an interesting way of separating the Soviet system, the Soviet government, from the Soviet people. And yet again, the role of fiction, the role of humor seems to play a big part in that. What do you see as the role of humor and fiction in how Reagan went about keeping those two groups separate?
I think it really humanized the people behind the Iron Curtain for Reagan, and he saw them as victims of the state and victims of the system in a way that is somewhat surprising for someone who was so stridently anti-communist, right? So, some of his favorite jokes, one he likes to tell a lot about, and it actually appears in a Clancy novel as well, about a businessman traveling from New York to Moscow, right? And so the businessman gets to a taxi in New York going to the airport, and he asks the cabbie, "Hey, you're in college, where are you going to be?" "I don't know. I haven't decided yet." Businessman lands in Moscow, gets another cab. That cabbie is also in college, so very educated cabbies here. And ask him, "Hey, what are you going to be?" "I don't know. They haven't told me yet." Same thing, joke that appears in Red Storm Rising when the defector has sent this letter to the high command to brag that he's taken their submarine and going away with it, right? Aramis is just kind of thumbing his nose at the Politburo with this. And it's sitting there in the stack of mail to be sorted. And the guy whose job it is to sort the mail looks at it. Says, "Oh, well, end of the day, as long as they pretend to pay me, we'll pretend to work." Right? And off he goes. Another one of Reagan's favorite jokes, and that ends up biting them because it delays their response to Aramis taking their October and defecting it, right? And so I think that's things that are showing that they're people just like Americans are, and that goes into his famous Anna and Yvonne speech in '83 as the tension been heightened. They're imagining this American couple and this Soviet couple who are magically trapped by a storm and able to speak freely to each other, and that they wouldn't talk about war and national politics. They would talk about their kids, what their hobbies are, what their jobs were, and they'd leave as friends. And so that's a very consistent theme in Reagan's approach to anti-communism. And I think you see this in the 50s when he gets involved in trying to rehabilitate the blacklisted, with Edmund Dmytryk being the most prominent of those ones as well. And you can see some of this in Kessler's Darkness at Noon, where, Rubyshev definitely deserves what's coming to him as, sir, he's going to be a victim of the state, but he also set up this horrible apparatus. He's betrayed people. But there are other characters in there, like one of the partisans that served under Rubyshev, right? This guy who lives in a dingy apartment, works as a janitor, if I'm remembering correctly. And, he's saying that this guy speaking, I don't recognize the speeches anymore from the, inspirational commander of the Russian Revolution that I fought under. And he prays, right? He's praying every time he hears the voice, just to acknowledge who Rubyshev was and everything. And so again, this role of religion being in there, the sense that religion is secretly lurking under Soviet control will burst free once those restrictions are lifted. Advisors like Jack Matlock and Susan Massey are also kind of pushing this narrative, trying to get him to identify very strongly with these people as, again, victims of their state rather than willing participants in some of the evils being perpetrated by the regime.
Well, it's certainly been a tour de force of Reagan's bookshelf over the last hour here. And I think normally what we do is we ask our guests on the podcast to recommend their favorite work on Reagan, but I think there's a better way to do this, and that's to ask you what's your favorite book that among Ronald Reagan's favorite books.
I mean, I still have a soft spot for the Clancy ones, right? And so I think Red Storm Rising is probably my favorite one right now. It's probably also the most relevant one right now with its World War III scenario. You got similarities to that and Ghost Fleet, what August Cole and P.W. Singer did a couple of years ago to use fiction to tell a story about war. Clear and Present Danger by Clancy, I think, is his best written work. It's also his most complex in how it deals with Ronald Reagan, because it's very much Clancy reacting to the Iran-Contra crisis. And so it creates a couple of extra layers there where Clancy still is clearly a Reagan supporter, but is trying to wrestle with his own response to again, the illegal activities of the administration in order to try and funnel weapons over to the Contras in Nicaragua. And so, I think that really speaks to the nature of this relationship and the complexity of it, where you have, fiction influencing policymakers, influencing fiction, and then influencing the public in a way that is tough to kind of navigate and to see, but to me, and hopefully to everyone listening, endlessly fascinating.
Well, I think that this podcast has been a great plug for some great works of fiction, great plug for people to get back in the books themselves. I'd like to thank you once more, Ben Griffin, for joining us. The new book is Reagan's War Stories, A Cold War Presidency, hot off the presses, September 15th. Everyone, please go get it, and we'll make sure we link to the book in the show notes. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Really appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.